Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm pulling out the Thank You Blooms registration press plate again from Spellbinders. I did a video with this a few weeks ago. This is being filmed after that was live. Otherwise, I would have joined the two together. I'm using some Arches black watercolor paper, and I wanted to see how some Cloud9 iridescent inks looked when better pressed on the black cardstock. So I have my better press system here. I have a piece of that watercolor cardstock that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I love that watercolor cardstock because it's nice and thick, so I should be able to get some really nice impression from the better press system. Now, if you've never used better press registration press plates, they are a bunch of plates that work together, and it comes with a registration template that shows you exactly where to put the different plates. And by having different plates and pressing them at different times, you can easily ink them with different colors. So it's a great way to get an image with a bunch of different ink colors. Now I am using the Cloud9 interference ink pads here. These show up differently on white cardstock than they do on black cardstock. So the color on the right side of the pad is the color they show up on black cardstock. So the color that you're seeing on the press plate is going to be closer to the color that is on the right side of that ink pad, or the cover of the ink pad. So when you see it on the press plate, that's not what's actually going to press. Now, what I realized really quickly with this is I needed to be very generous with my ink here. Now, if you haven't seen any of my other videos using the registration press plates, I do find that they're much easier to use with the smaller pads, because the larger pads, it's really easy to get ink on that registration template. If you do get ink on that, I recommend wiping it up with a soft cloth just to make sure none of that ink presses onto your image. I've found that it's much easier to get that ink around the image with using the registration press plates and the registration template. So definitely be vigilant and make sure that you are wiping off that ink if any of it gets on that background there. So after this first one here and realizing I needed to be quite generous with my ink, I decided to ink up my templates or ink up my press plates on a place on that background where it wasn't where they were going to be put before pressing. So I inked them and then moved them and then used my cloth to clean that registration template to make sure that that was nice and clean. I'm just using my fingers here, and I found it didn't interfere with the image at all. If you find that you're having a hard time moving them with the image, you can just use a die pick or something that is pointy really carefully to help move them. They're really quite easy to move. With this registration template, I find that the plates move a lot easier because the magnet isn't quite as strong. So the colors that I'm using here for the Cloud9 interference ink pads, the first one was called Sweet Treat. The second one is Peacock Tails, and now I'm using Lavender Fields. And I wanted to use some beautiful colors for the flowers. And then I'm going to also use one for the thank you in the center. Now, this Lavender Fields, it looks purple on the plate, but like I said before, the color that it's going to show up on the black is not the color that it's going to show up on the plate. So it takes a little bit to get used to the fact that you see a different color on the plate than shows up on the background. But it's kind of like magic as well. And that's one of the reasons why I like to call these pads my magic pads, because the color that it shows up on the cardstock isn't always the same as what's on the pad, especially if you're using dark cardstock. Now I'm using an embossing powder tool here because I wanted to emboss this sentiment. I want to give it a little bit of a different texture than the rest of the press plate background. So I wanted to put some of that embossing powder tool on there to make sure that when I put my embossing powder on there, it's going to stick in the right areas and not going to stick on the whole image. So I have fruit salad here that I'm using, and even though it looks like it's a coral color on the plates, it's more of a yellow color. But once I lifted it up, it looked a little bit too close to the green color that I have for my greenery. So I grabbed some gold embossing powder. My initial plan was to have it be yellow and then use clear embossing powder, but because it showed up a little bit too green for my liking, I chose some gold embossing powder instead. I wanted a color that was going to show up against the flower and the greenery colors, and I wanted something that was going to complement it as well. You could also use silver here. I just chose gold simply because it was closer to the yellow that I had intended. That ended up looking a little bit too green for my liking. So I have a soft brush here. I'm just using that to get any of the embossing powder that stuck in any of the areas that I didn't want it to. There are some little tiny bits around some of the areas that I left. It's a very minimal amount, and I thought a little bit of gold on some of the areas where some of the ink pressed out and it was a little bit heavier would add a nice complement to the gold lettering. Once I have all of the embossing powder that I don't want anywhere else, I take out my embossing tool and melt that powder. And I really love the different texture that adding embossing to part of a better pressed image gives. It just gives a nice contrast and a nice complement to that background. And I absolutely love how these colors look on the black. If you've never seen my other video with this, I use it on a light background. I'll link to it at the very end. Now these interference ink pads, they have some pigment in them, but they're easy to clean. So these were cleaned off simply by running under water. I used no cleaner at all, so you don't have to use any cleaner with them. Any of the remaining color that was on those plates were stained from using Better Press ink before, so it's not from those ink pads. They come off, they wash off really, really easily. I trimmed that watercolor paper down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches by taking a 1/4 inch off of each one of the sides. And then I have a piece of white cardstock here that I trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4. I just wanted to show you how if you don't have any metallic to go with the image that you're going for, you can easily create some. So I just took some Versamark ink, pressed it on the side, and then put that same gold embossing powder that I have on the inside image on my thank you. And I'm just creating kind of a faux metallic cardstock. Now there's no need to do the entire cardstock piece because that image is going to be on the front of it. So I only need to do it around the outside edges and just make sure that it is covered by the inside piece. The other thing that I could have done here is I could have used a black piece of cardstock and then chose one of those interference pads that are on the image on the inside and then used the same method that I'm using with the Versamark pad with that interference ink pad. I've used it many times in videos. It's a great way if you don't happen to have a cardstock that matches your ink exactly. It's a great way to kind of create the look of cardstock that color by using the ink that you want to match. Just a little, kind of a little cheat. Next, I'm using some Barely Art glue and I'm gluing those pieces in place. Just putting a large acrylic block over top of it to hold it flat and make sure that everything has good contact while it's drying. And it frees up your hands to use with other things as well. Once that is completely dry, I'm taking some platinum stickles here and I'm just adding some dots in the center of the flowers. Platinum stickles has gold in it, but it's more of a silver tone gold. It's not too yellow. I'm not really a fan of yellowy gold, so I tend to choose ones that have more of an antique or a silver tone, and this one is perfect. And by just doing little dots, it's going to take less time to dry, but it's still going to have a gold sparkle that gives it an extra little bit of texture and also ties in with the gold thank you as well as the gold matte. I absolutely love the way this turned out on the black. I think it looks absolutely gorgeous and quite striking compared to the one done with the white background. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you spending your time with me. Have a fantastic day.